Every now and then, public anger at a perceived injustice or political situation bubbles over and explodes into a violent and destructive outburst. Groups of people will take to the street, often fighting each other and the police, as well as destroying property. Such riots have been common throughout history, and here are my choices for 5 of the most deadly and destructive. Number 5. The New York City Draft Riots. Taking place between July the 13th and July 16th, 1863, the New York City Draft Riots are the largest in American history. At that time, the Civil War was still raging, and the armies of the Union were severely depleted. With volunteers in short supply, it was decided that a draft was needed in order to conscript men and bolster the Union's military strength. Names of local white men between the ages of 20 and 45 were gathered and written onto pieces of paper. The paper slips would then be rolled up and placed into a hand-cranked drum, known as the Wheel of Misfortune, before being pulled out at random. The army officers needed to conscript a quota of 1,500 men from New York City who had no desire to fight. Discontent with the draft in New York had reached boiling point. It was possible to avoid the draft by paying a $300 fee, which is the equivalent of about $5,000 in today's money. However, most working class people simply did not have this kind of cash. In addition to this, racial tensions in the city were already strained, as many of New York's working class Irish resented having to compete with freed slaves for low-paying work. The situation was extremely volatile, however the first day of the draft passed peacefully. By the time the second draw took place on Monday, the mood had changed. An angry crowd, 500 strong, attacked the Provost Marshal's office, where the draft was being held, and set the building on fire. The riot quickly spread, targeting wealthy areas as well as African Americans living in the city. Seeing these men as competition for scarce jobs, the crowd began beating and killing them, as well as destroying any businesses that had catered to them. Order was finally restored 3 days later, when federal troops marched into the city. However, the riots had already left their mark. It's estimated that at least 120 people were killed, and accounts of men having their fingers and toes cut off and taken as souvenirs give some insight into the brutality involved. Millions of dollars of damage was caused, and at least 2,000 people were left injured. Despite the violence, New York's support for the Union survived the riots, and by the end of the war as many as 450,000 men from the state had enlisted and served. Number 4. The Battle of Cable Street. In the years following the First World War, Europe was experiencing high levels of unemployment, coupled with economic depression and social unrest. Extremism in politics was on the rise, and an ideological conflict between communism and fascism was taking place. It was against this backdrop that Oswald Mosley had established the British Union of Fascists, and the methods of his black shirts closely resembled those of Hitler and his Nazi brown shirts in Germany. With anti-Semitism on the rise throughout Europe, Jews were increasingly being made the scapegoat in England, with the Jewish community in East London being specifically targeted. On Sunday the 4th of October 1936, Mosley planned to have thousands of his supporters march through East London. In response to this, an estimated 100,000 anti-fascist demonstrators took to the streets in an attempt to halt Mosley's black shirts. The government expected violence and arranged for 6,000 policemen to escort the 3,000 fascists and clear the route of any obstacles, thus allowing the march to continue. The protesters made their stand at Cable Street, building roadblocks and arming themselves with improvised weapons in an attempt to halt the march. Vicious fighting broke out as protesters clashed with black shirts and policemen, and hand-to-hand fighting took place with sticks, rocks, and anything that the rioters could get their hands on. After a series of running battles, the police advised Mosley to abandon the march in an attempt to prevent further bloodshed, and the black shirts were diverted away from the area. Protesters continued to clash with the police, and around 150 demonstrators were arrested, with 175 people injured. In an odd twist to the story, several policemen were arrested by demonstrators amid claims of police brutality and biased treatment. The riot became known as the Battle of Cable Street, and the events of that day played a major role in the passing of the Public Order Act that same year, which required police consent for political marches and banned the wearing of political uniforms in public. This is generally viewed as leading to the decline of the British Union of Fascists, before the organisation was eventually disbanded in 1940 after the outbreak of World War II. Number 3. The Moscow Copper Riots. After the Second Northern War Russia had fought with Sweden and Poland between 1655 and 1660, the Russian economy had been left in dire straits. Taxes shot up, and the Russian government resorted to the drastic measure of issuing copper coins and assigning them an equal value to existing silver currency. The effort proved disastrous, silver seas being circulated, and the economy collapsed. The purchasing power of the copper money was a tiny amount compared to the silver coins, and counterfeiting became rampant as the value of the copper coins was far greater than the cost of simply making them yourself. There were rumours circulating that top Russian officials had been involved in counterfeiting operations, and many people believed that a list existed containing the names of those officials responsible for the economic calamity. These lists of the guilty were posted in areas of Moscow, and the people named were accused of collaborating with Russia's old enemy, Poland. On July 25, 1662, a group of angry citizens met to air their grievances. The army failed to respond to this growing gathering, and many soldiers even joined in with the demonstrations. After 3 hours, a group from the crowd eventually descended upon the Tsar's residence and demanded that those accused of taking part in counterfeiting be handed over to the mob for punishment. The Tsar promised to investigate the mob's grievances, as well as pledged to lower taxes. The Tsar's pledge seemed to placate the protesters, and they headed back to Moscow. However, upon returning to the city, they discovered that a mob of several thousand people had instigated a massive riot in which the warehouses and homes of wealthy merchants had been attacked and destroyed. The two groups of protesters teamed up and headed back to the Tsar's residence. However, the Tsar was now prepared. Around 6,000 soldiers had been assembled to quell the riot, and the Tsar quickly put them to use. Of the 10,000 rioters, an estimated 1,000 were killed, many being hung or drowned in the nearby river. Thousands more were arrested, tortured, and exiled. Although the riot only lasted a day, it was extremely bloody and shook the ruling class. The harsh economic measures continued. However, by 1663, the copper coinage was abolished, and Russia returned to silver money. Number 2. The LA Riots. The LA riots took place over 6 days in April 1992 and erupted in response to charges being dropped against 4 police officers who were involved in the infamous beating of Rodney King, which was caught on videotape. Rodney King was an African American who had been involved in a high-speed police chase and was severely beaten by the 4 police officers after being captured, which led to an outpouring of anger at police brutality and racism. Within 30 minutes of the verdict being announced, a crowd of 300 people assembled at the Los Angeles County Courthouse to protest the verdict, and that same evening reports of looting and assaults began to rise. By the next day, violence, looting and arson had become widespread, and the police seemed to have lost control of the situation, despite a curfew being implemented. Store owners organised to defend their businesses from roaming mobs of people, and gun battles were frequent and caught on television. Infamous scenes of Korean store owners taking to the rooftops of their shops, armed with guns, spread across the news, as they desperately battled to save their livelihoods. By the third day, the California National Guard, consisting of 4,000 troops, moved into the city, eventually rising to a total of 10,000 troops in an effort to assist police and restore order. By the fourth day, the violence finally seemed to be under control, and a peace rally was held which over 30,000 people attended. The US Justice Department announced that it would launch a federal investigation into the Rodney King beating, and by day 6 the curfew was finally lifted. Although incidents of violence continued for several more days, the riots seemed to have finally been quelled. The cost of the riots was staggering. 55 people were killed, 2,000 were injured, and around $1 billion in damage was caused. A massive 3,600 fires had been set, destroying over 1,100 buildings. The violence involved in the riots shocked the world, and causes of death ranged from shootings to beatings, and there was even one case of strangling. Following the riots, over 11,000 people were arrested, many of those people being turned into police by neighbours who were furious at the destruction of their local community. Many of the stores destroyed in the riots were never rebuilt, and whole communities were left in ruin. Number 1. The Nika Riots. Chariot racing in the ancient Byzantine Empire was extremely popular amongst the people. Teams were indicated by the colour of the uniform worn by competitors, and supporters of each team would show their support by wearing the colour of their favourite team, much like in sports today. There were 2 main teams involved in the chariot racing, one denoted by the colour blue, the other by green. In AD 532, the Emperor Justinian was a supporter of the blue team. It's thought that the 2 teams represented far more than just sport, and your support for a colour would depend on various social and political issues, much like modern political parties, although the exact nature of what each side stood for is still disputed amongst scholars. Many historians believe that the blues represented the ruling and upper classes, while the greens were the party of the people. Just like today, supporters were extremely passionate, and bloody riots would often take place during and after a race. However, the events that occurred in 532 were far more serious. The year before, members of both teams had been arrested and charged with murder following an especially bloody riot that had taken place after a race. The prisoners were to be hanged for their crimes, and while most of them eventually received the death penalty, one blue and one green managed to escape with the backing of their respective teams, and the two teams found themselves united for the first time. This was a trying time for the emperor, who was in the middle of tense negotiations with the neighbouring Persian Empire, and was also dealing with discontent amongst his own people over high taxes. To avoid any further unrest, he spared the two escaped men's lives, and changed their sentence to imprisonment. However, this failed to satisfy the green and blue teams, who wanted their men pardoned completely. The atmosphere at the next chariot race on January 13th, 532 was explosive, and as soon as the race began, the crowd began shouting insults at the emperor. They began shouting Nika, which means win or conquer, and working themselves into a frenzy, eventually burst forward and attacked the emperor himself. The emperor's palace was placed under siege, and much of Constantinople burned in the riot that followed over the next 5 days. Seeing the emperor in such a weak position, a group of ambitious politicians saw a chance to overthrow him. They threw their support behind the rioters and declared a new emperor to replace him. Justinian considered running away, however it's said that his wife persuaded him to stay and fight. He hatched a plan and sent one of his advisors into the hippodrome, which was at the heart of the riot, offering the Blues his support and a large bag of gold. He also reminded the Blues that the new emperor was a green. This, coupled with the large payment of gold, seems to have been enough to sway the Blues back to his side, and they dispersed, leaving the Greens alone in the hippodrome. Soldiers loyal to the emperor immediately attacked the Greens, killing most of them. It's estimated that up to 30,000 rioters were killed in the riot and subsequent massacre at the hippodrome, which would have been around 10% of the city's population. Order was soon re-established, and the power of the Greens and Blues was broken. So those are my choices for 5 of the most deadly and destructive riots of all time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again on next week's video.